We have a partnership here with Focus on the Family, and Focus on the Family, and an anonymous donor whose brother suffered with schizophrenia, partnered together with LifeWay Research to do this study, and the end result was we did a study from 3 samples. The 3 samples were 1,000 Protestant pastors. Now, the reason we do Protestant pastors is there's just a different polity in the way other denominational groups work, and so it's very difficult to get a sample, for example, of what a senior pastor, priest, or minister is at other traditions. And so we did Protestant pastors, we did breakouts for evangelicals, which would be the tradition from which we're from. We also did panels on both those who suffer with mental illness, who indicated their terminology that they were diagnosed with a mental illness, and we actually surveyed them through the phone. There was a phone panel of the pastors, an online panel for those who indicated diagnosis with mental illness, asked them questions related to faith, and then furthermore, we then also tied in and looked at those who are family members. And so I think they're going to run it from the back, and so I'll just kind of, let's go ahead and go to the first slide here. But let me start with this. It might seem a little odd, but let me explain why in just a moment. That's the Orlando Sentinel. It's on January 16th, 2003. The headline is, a Winter Park woman who holds degrees in law and medicine faces federal charges of shipping guns to Northern Ireland, where she claims British troops beat her. Some of you are immediately saying, why are we talking about Irish nationalism? Why are we talking about that after a Scottish vote in the other direction? Why is this even part of the conversation? Let's go into the next slide because I want you to read. It says, Bannon does not practice medicine and has not practiced law since suffering from an unspecified disability in the mid-1980s. And so we begin to see, well, what's going on here? She takes a, quote, considerable amount of medication, her attorney said, and then it talks about this Irish Republican Army and things of that sort. So this is 2003. This is a little over 10 years ago. John Bannon, her brother, gives some more information. We won't necessarily share the rest of that. But here's a situation where a brilliant woman who is both a doctor and a lawyer, actually worked as Elton John's personal physician, traveled the world, but just brilliant beyond measure, grew up in a home where perhaps the acknowledgement of some other issues was not allowed. Actually, she grew up in a home outside of New York City on Long Island in an Irish Catholic home with my mother and with my uncles and aunts. She is my aunt, as a matter of fact, and she grew up there, and we often heard whispers of well, we called her Peggy. They called her Margaret in the story. We often heard whispers of Peggy's situation, but nobody ever spoke of what mental illness was or why mental illness ultimately mattered. She was my aunt. She was actually a role model of sorts. I would later go on to do my undergraduate degree in pre-med, preparing actually to be a physician until God kind of redirected my path as he often does. And I wrote about her story because it's public, and I wrote about it in an article after the Matthew Warren's tragic suicide. I wrote about it in an article in CNN, actually, and another family member as well who exercised what's often called in the popular vernacular suicide by cop. But the reality is we just didn't talk about these things. As a matter of fact, the person mentioned at the bottom of the article, John Bannon, he was a retired New York City police officer. My grandfather was the battalion chief for Lower Manhattan, and these are just things that in the Irish Catholic, well, we weren't really Catholic. The Catholic Church was the church we didn't go to on Sundays. But in my Irish Catholic family's upbringing, we didn't speak of these things because they spoke of weakness and they spoke of brokenness and things we did not understand. There was a stigma that was evident and present and real, and yet what's fascinating to me is that now as we look to research at churches and just years and years later, and perhaps in a way we might say a more progressive time on these issues, we still find, much like my Irish Catholic family growing up on Long Island outside of New York City, is that in churches, stigma still remains. We still whisper quietly about what things are and what things are not. And today we look at the statistical situation, and I think we would rightfully find some challenge and some opportunity for growth. I should add, not because I'm at all pleased about the situation, but the reason I feel a freedom to share our stories with the permission of some family members, but also soon after this story, she took her own life when she went off of her medication. And at that point, my family began to speak of publicly and openly what was whispered privately and in shame. is that mental illness is real, mental illness is prevalent, and mental illness impacts us all. So we do research at LifeWay Research, and I'm not in the mental health field. My PhD is not in a mental health field. It's in a field related to research. And so I'm going to present some research to you today that others have already articulated implications of such, because it's just best practices. My desire is to actually give you perhaps some numbers that you can use, and I would ask you if you wouldn't mind to kind of hold off on tweeting or Facebooking some of these numbers until Monday, but you're getting a pre-release today that will be in the national media on Monday. And so let me just tell you a little bit about the statistics. If I press this, will it work, or do you need to run it from the back? Okay, so I'm going to press and see. Let's see. All right, so again, 3 samples here, and I don't have time to give you all the methodology, though that is deeply disturbing to a person who does statistical research, but you'll find all that released on Monday. But let me give you some high-level pictures. So let's take a look at the next slide, and what we can see here is how often pastors speak to this issue. I'm going to address this throughout. Is kind of minimal. Matter of fact, about 66% say once a year, rarely or never do they actually in any way mention mental illness in a message or sermon or homily. Yet, when you talk to persons who struggle with mental illness, and people, family members who are there as well, they actually want their church to talk openly about the issue so the topic will not be taboo. 2/3 almost among family of a person with a mental illness, and 59% agreeing somewhat or strongly among those who struggle with a mental illness. And so I think we're increasingly in a conversation that points us to the fact that we need more conversation. And it's not to say that pastors are unaware of the actual issues going on here. As the next slide illustrates, 59% of pastors have actually counseled one or more people who were eventually diagnosed with an acute mental illness. And so we know the facts are that pastors and police are often the first responders in a mental health crisis. And we often will debate the varying levels of preparation for the police, but as Matt's recent study that has rightfully gained some national attention has pointed out to, there's not as much preparation as we might think and hope for those entering and engaging pastoral ministry, when we know that pastors and police will be and are the first responders so often. Matter of fact, we actually found in the next slide that 38% of pastors strongly agree they feel equipped to identify a person dealing with an acute mental illness that may require a referral to a medical professional. And so we actually have pastors who are of the belief that they are able to identify and refer, and I think those are some good news things. There's good news and challenging news in here. I want us to look at both. For example, on the next slide, 41% of pastors actually strongly disagree that they are reluctant to get involved with those with acute mental illnesses because previous experiences strained time and resources. Now, a couple of things that may be helpful when it comes to research. When we do statistical research, there's kind of a 2-word scientific phrase that I think is important when you're surveying clergy. Here's those 2 words. It's a little technical, but it's pastors lie. Let me explain why that is. I mean, not intentionally, but it's what we call the halo effect. And what that means is and the halo effect is not just an effect. The halo effect is not just something that pastors experience. It's actually just a statistical reality. If I might give an example without offending your political sensibilities, if you ask the majority of Americans, did they vote for George Bush, they would say no. Why? Because he has low poll ratings now. Well, the majority of Americans did vote for George Bush the second time. But if you ask the majority of Americans if they voted for Barack Obama, they would say no. That way I don't offend your political sensibilities, because he too has low poll ratings right now. So people actually remember the societally desirable answer, and so it's not that they're intentionally lying, it's that they tend to answer what they perceive would be the right answer if they were a better person. And thus, this is why people inflate their church attendance, and according to surveys, about 44% of Americans attend church on a weekly basis, and all of you would have about 7 services if that was actually a factually correct situation. Now, the thing is, we consistently know that they do that, so we know that they overestimate what they do or they do not do. But so what we would see is this. To me, what is perhaps particularly remarkable is that 23% strongly or somewhat agree actually that they are reluctant. They do have reluctance to get involved. And I think if we actually looked at the actions of many pastors, we would see their actions speak more often like the 23% than like the 41%. 56% on the next slide strongly agree that local churches have a responsibility to provide resources and support to individuals with mental illness and their family. That's encouraging. I notice you might notice that there's 7% that disagree either somewhat or strongly, and that's always the case. When you get to those low numbers, here's something that will always help you remember the low numbers on a poll. 7% of Americans also believe that the moon landing was faked. And so anytime you look at a poll, you see something 5, 6, or 7%, there's always going to be somebody in that category. It's helpful to remember that to be the case. So the vast mainstream view is that churches should have a role, but I want you to see in just a few moments that perhaps that role is more aspirational than actualized. That role perhaps might be more aspirational than actualized. Let me share with you some things that I think might surprise you. When I've been talking to several reporters about this, they have embargoed copies of the research that they won't use till Monday, 1 o'clock. Did I mention that Monday, 1 o'clock thing? All right, just want to make sure I mention that to you because I trust you and I can find you. But on the next slide, this is one of the things that surprised me, is that the question of medication, because, I mean, there seems to be a debate sometimes in the Christian community about the use of medication. And I don't think that should surprise us, because there's a debate in modern culture and context about medication. And I think there's a prevalent idea that we are over-medicated. I think there would be many, if not the majority of people in this room, that would say too often we rush to medication on some issues. If we asked it in that way, speaking of haste, we hear people talking about, children and medication, and I'm actually not here to take a position on that issue, but I think that society is having this debate. That's been reflected in the church. But I want you to look at the answer to the pastors. Now, the questions are always down in the bottom of the slide, and it says, which of the following best reflects your opinions on how prescription drugs should be used to treat acute mental illness? So psychotropic drugs, what's their view? Well, the answer actually, medications should never be used to treat acute mental illness, was actually 0%. Now, 0%, just so you know, we round the numbers, so it's actually 0.3% were those who actually said that. So of the 1,000 pastors surveyed, we had about 5% who said don't know. And so of the 1,000 pastors surveyed, we're talking just a few dozen actually had a view that medication should never be used. It's slightly higher when we break it out by evangelical, but not this. In other words, this is the anti-medication mentality that you may have read on a blog or read on the internet is not a mainstream view among Protestants or evangelical pastors at all. And so with that being said, there are others. Medication should be used at least as a last resort to treat mental illness, 7%. We have medication should be used in moderation to treat acute mental illness is 47%. And then and really at any time they use symptoms is actually 40%. Indicate that to be their belief. Now let's kind of break down a little bit more, and let's look at psychological therapy for just a moment. Put that on the screen, and we actually see the numbers a little bit different, which is actually, it was interesting to me that 0%, really 0.3, but rounded 0% said you should that they never had this, they weren't anti-medicine, but it is 2% actually. That indicated that psychological therapy, talk therapy, but psychological therapy should never be used. And we can make a hypothesis. I couldn't say with certainty about some of these issues, but perhaps the perception of psychology and psychiatry having some foundations that would be different than the theological foundations of some of the pastors. We don't know. We'd actually like to do more research on that subject. Let's break down the opening graphic a little bit more on the next slide. 49% of pastors rarely or never speak to their church. When we took the last two categories, if we take once a year, we get up to 66%, a substantial majority. Now again, when we look across the spectrum, we several times a month. I mean, so what is it, 2 or 3, 4 times a month? That's about 3% would indicate that. So the prevalence of communicating on this issue is really towards the side of of not much at all. And I think that's probably important. Matter of fact, I think that's a lot of what you're hearing today through the speakers today. Let's talk more about it. Well, let me give you some statistical evidence that we're not talking much about it, and thus the let's talk more about it is rooted in both a need but also an opportunity. I've been asked by many reporters this week is why are evangelicals, I recognize that we have a diverse coalition here and I'm thankful for such, but I come from the evangelical tradition. Why are evangelicals particularly interested in this subject? And Matt, who shared our data, which, by the way, I had to edit my PowerPoint, thanks for taking that. But Matt, who shared the data, our LifeWay Research data, earlier indicated that evangelicals have at a higher percentage a belief that, that prayer and scriptural study alone can heal mental illness. Now let me say that I believe in a God who's sovereign. God can do whatever he wants. And he does do whatever he wants, and oftentimes in miraculous or wonderful ways. But the disproportionate, I want you to hear this, I believe, and I've said this to several reporters, is that evangelicals, and not Protestants, right, and I wouldn't say Catholics, evangelicals are disproportionately stigmatizing mental illness in their communities to the detriment of their parishioners. And I think that that's important because I think that this is, in some ways, this has been an evangelical moment. It's broader than an evangelical moment, and that's why I'm glad we're here. But it is also an evangelical moment. Rick and Kay Warren have really helped to reshape a conversation in evangelicalism in a way that I think is helpful and necessary. There is taboo here, and that taboo has to be broken. But here it is. To break a troubling stigma, you need to have transparent speech. To break a troubling stigma, you need to have transparent speech. And there's not a lot of conversation going on in congregations about mental illness. If we use the NAMI numbers, 1 out of 4 experience mental illness in a given year. Don't miss that, in a given year. If a quarter of your congregation, some of you are pastors here today, if a quarter of your congregation in a given year was going to struggle with cancer, you would dedicate the first 2-month sermons to the topic of dealing with and being among a family that is struggling with cancer. And yet, statistically, a quarter of the people in our congregation, thus most of the families will be impacted by mental illness in a given year. Yet, 66% of pastors speak of the issue once a year or less. Just mention the issue once a year or less. Now again, let's take a look at the next slide, and let's see that there is encouraging news here, right? Pastors indicate, now we know there'll be a little halo effect here, but pastors indicate that they are doing some things to prepare for these issues in ministry and life. For example, we asked them specifically, which of the following learning resources, if any, have you used to specifically care for people with acute mental illness? And for example, 66% said they read several books on counseling. I would affirm that. I think that's a great thing. 38% of pastors, now keep in mind that when you survey all pastors, you're not getting necessarily seminary graduates or even Bible college graduates, so you're calling all pastors in a random sampling. And so not all of you went to school, yet some have said that they have taken seminary, 41% taken seminary courses, utilized websites to research on the issue, attended a conference. I mean, so there's certainly some positive indication of development. Now let me say too, though, I think we need to recognize, looking at the next slide, that pastors too, one more, pastors too struggle with issues of mental illness. Matter of fact, 23% actually indicated, now about half said that it was diagnosed, half said it was not. I'd like to drill in on that subject more, but we in a poll, you don't have the ability to do that. You need to move to a qualitative kind of research. But about 23% indicate they have personally struggled with mental illness of some kind. Now that shouldn't surprise us, but I will tell you, I was asked Thursday by a reporter, what do pastors talk about this? And I said, no. I mean, pastors talk about this in one of two ways. Either when they're in a prominent ministry role where now it's safe to say that you struggle because already you've achieved some sort of ministry place, or in some sort of writing after they're gone. So we look back and see Spurgeon struggled clearly with depression. And so, but the reality is that telling a search committee, sharing with a bishop who might appoint you that you struggle with mental illness is not a pathway for career ministry success. And so we would rejoice when we see Perry Noble, for example, a prominent pastor of one of the 5 largest churches in America, talk about his own struggle with serious depression. But I mean, I think it's easier to share that when your attendance is 30,000 on a weekend than it is when your attendance is 300 and you might need another job. And so I think the reality and the challenge is that how can we get those pastors to begin to share about that? One of the things I've tried to do on my own communication platforms is my blog at Christianity Today and other places is to sort of highlight when pastors are transparent on some of these issues. And so, for example, Carlos Whitaker, well-known Christian singer, musician, Sheila Walsh. I mean, so just communicating some of those things. So we see that we need to destigmatize in evangelicalism, maybe disproportionately so, and beyond as well. A few more things, and then I need to finish up. My time is short. Let me just mention a couple of more things. This is looking at the mental health family member survey. Go to the next slide. And this is a 207 Protestant family members. The margin of error would be substantially higher on these. Still valuable and helpful, particularly when they're overwhelmingly pointing in one direction. But for example, I've only drawn a few statistics out of what's a rather large study that's actually being released in 2 phases. It'll end up being kind of a series of scholarly articles that'll be published later, and then a book as well. I'm not the author of that book, but it'll be a group of scholars that are engaging in that. But here, for example, next slide says 17% say their family member's mental illness impacted which church their family chose to attend. I think it's interesting it's not higher. One of the surprising things, I think, as we'll see in just a moment, there seems to be often an expectation that the church talks more about this than does much about this. And I'll show you that in just a minute, why that actually is the case. As a matter of fact, another one, 75% say their church has been supportive among those, this is family members. So 75% said there's been support and encouragement from the church. But when you actually ask, well, what does the church do intentionally? Now, if you remember a few slides ago, we looked at, and 68% said that, for example, the church has a list of mental health experts to which they can refer. So remember, the pastors were over 2/3 saying, yeah, we have a list. But let's take a look at the family members of those who struggle with mental illness in the next slide. If you look at the third one down, about 1/3 of the people who, well, be the ones that might contact the pastor about that referral list actually think there is one. So the pastors say, over 2/3 say, yeah, we have a list, and almost, with the exception of 1 or 2 here, almost every one of these answers, when you compare the answers of pastors, are substantially more rosy, positive, engaged, involved than actually the people who have family members who struggle with mental illness perceive them to be. I mean, statistically significant differences that really point to a difference in understanding. So they say good things about their church, and this is key too, they probably are engaging in a church that has a disproportionate level of interest and love for persons who struggle. But having been there, they still are of the perception that the church is much less engaged than actually the pastors perceive the church to be engaged. We look at the survey, next slide, of those who've been diagnosed with a mental illness, and we explain all the methodology. I know many of you will know, how did you get to that? And it'll all be released on Monday, and the methodology will be there. But I wasn't mentioning Monday again to be funny, but since you brought it up, I mentioned Monday. All right, put down that camera, sir. When you talk to people who struggle with mental health, let's take a look at the next slide. 53% say the local church has been supportive, and that's encouraging. I think one of the things I hope you're hearing over and over again from the speakers and the presenters is that the job of the church is not to abdicate its role in mental health. Abdication is really missing what even those who are in the secular branches of psychology and psychiatry would say, that there is psychological health and better well-being when we're connected with a faith community. But it does not matter as much to me what their perception is. What matters to me is what the Bible teaches. When Jesus announces and inaugurates his public ministry in Luke chapter 4, he says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He has anointed me to preach good news." And then he talks about broken people. He talks about the captive. He talks about the blind. Throughout the ministry of Jesus, he served the hurting. And the world is continuously surprised that the followers of Jesus who serve the hurting seem to be less inclined to actually do so. And so thus, this just makes sense, but the role of the church is not to abdicate its part because we refer, but on the other pendulum swing is isolation. Abdication and isolation is the church isolates itself from a community of caring professionals who want to be part of what is a medical treatment and diagnosis plan or a therapy plan that leads to wholeness and well-being. And so the church doesn't need to abdicate and doesn't need to isolate, but instead needs to find that place in the middle where the gospel flows forth, the implications lived out in their lives, that cares for hurting people. And 53%, I was encouraged to see, actually indicated their church has been supportive. You go to the next slide, it actually goes to 67% when it talks about the church, that they're attending church regularly, that the church actually is supportive. Again, it's important here that there's a difference between what we call correlation and causation. People are going to go to churches that are supportive. But I want you to hear that in our random sample, we didn't go through churches to get to these people. We went through an exterior secular means in an online panel to do so. And yet when we asked those who were identified as Protestants, their own beliefs, saying, yeah, the church has been supportive. When we asked those who are in a church, 2/3 of them indicated the church has been supportive. But let me remind you again, and I need to close with this. You know what it means when a guest speaker says, let me close with this? Absolutely nothing, but let me close with this. Remember the slide that I put up at the beginning? Let's put that back up again, the next one. Just click the next slide. Is that there's a great need to speak more on this issue. I think it's shifting. I don't know for sure. I don't know what the future holds. I'm not a prophet, not the son of a prophet. I work at a nonprofit research organization. But it seems that things are shifting in a greater level of awareness and engagement on issues of mental health. I'm particularly concerned as an evangelical that would be evidenced inside evangelicalism, but also more broadly around. So when I had the privilege of writing, CNN asked me to write an article, I was struck by just how many people shared their own story. And I wanted to start by sharing Margaret Bannon, Peggy, we called her. I want to say her name because I think there's a whole lot of people in the family of my origin, good people, good, hard-working, working-class New York City civil service class people. And we whispered quietly, we hid it, and didn't want to talk about it. But let me just say that often my family of origin, sometimes that's my family of faith. And so my exhortation to you and my exhortation to me and the church that I'm a part of is that we might move beyond the whispering and the quiet and the shame and the stigma. And we might instead know that Jesus came. He came seeking and serving the lost and the broken. And we honor him when we join him in his mission. The church has a long way to go. Talking more about it will help it get there. But then the next steps will be me more and more involved. Thank you for the opportunity to share with you this morning.